My grandfather used to tell this story every time we sat by the fire during those quiet autumn evenings. I remember the way his voice would drop, the flicker of the flames reflecting in his eyes, as if he were back there in that small village, reliving every moment. It was after the war in 1947, when he rented a cottage on the outskirts of North Yorkshire. He had just returned home, hoping to escape the noise and find some peace in the countryside. The village he moved to was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. But there was something strange about the villagers, especially when it came to the dense forest that bordered the town. They never went near it, and they'd get real quiet whenever he mentioned it. Now, Grandpa wasn't the kind of man to be spooked easily. He figured it was just old folklore or local superstitions, nothing more. But he said things started getting strange about a month after he moved in. One night, when the air was cold and still, he was sitting by the fire, reading, when he heard a knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just a soft, hesitant knock. He thought it might be the wind at first, but when he went to check, no one was there. Just the dark night, the fog rolling in thick and the sound of the trees creaking in the distance. He shut the door and sat back down, but then the knock came again, this time louder and more urgent. He opened the door once more, nothing, except this time he saw something in the distance. At the edge of the clearing near where the trees began, there was a figure. A woman, standing perfectly still. He said she was dressed in old, tattered clothes, soaked as if she had just walked out of a river, though there was no river nearby, and her face, it wasn't right. He described it as pale and hollow, like something drained the life out of her. But what got to him most were her eyes. Empty, cold, staring right through him. Grandpa, being the man he was, called out to her, asking if she needed help, but she didn't respond. Instead, she just raised her arm and pointed toward the woods behind her. Then, without a word, she turned and walked into the fog. I remember the way Grandpa's voice would lower here, like he was almost ashamed of what came next. He said he should have locked the door and stayed inside, but instead, something pushed him to follow her. He grabbed a lantern and stepped out into the night. The fog was thick, and the further he went into the woods, the quieter everything became. No wind, no rustling leaves, just this heavy silence pressing down on him. He could see the woman up ahead, always just a little too far to reach, leading him deeper into the forest. Eventually, they came to a clearing. In the middle of it stood this ancient tree, its branches twisted and gnarled. At the base of the tree was a grave, half dug up, and poking out of the dirt were bones, human bones. The woman stood at the edge of the grave, looking down as if she was mourning. But then, slowly, she turned to face my grandfather, and when their eyes met, he swore he heard her voice, not with his ears, but inside his head. She whispered, "He did this." Before Grandpa could process what was happening, he heard a rustling behind him. He turned, and there, standing just behind him, was an old man from the village. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't be here," the man had said. "She's been dead for 20 years. The old man grabbed Grandpa's arm and pulled him away from the clearing. He didn't explain much, but he didn't need to. Grandpa never went back to that cottage. He left the next day without a word to anyone. When Grandpa told me this story, he always ended it the same way. He'd look me in the eye and say, "I don't know if what I saw was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but whatever was out there in those woods, it wasn't something meant to be disturbed." And then, after a pause, he'd add, "Even now, sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see her, standing there, pointing to that grave, waiting." It gave me chills every time he told it. And even though I never saw those woods myself, I always got the feeling that something about that story was more real than he ever wanted to admit. It started innocently enough. My friends and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We needed an escape, just a weekend away from the city. A couple of us were going through some tough times, work stress, relationship drama, the usual crap, and we thought a little time in nature might do the trick. There were 4 of us, me, Tom, his girlfriend Sarah, and my best friend Jake. We picked a spot far enough away from the usual touristy places. Jake had found this secluded area deep in the mountains, It wasn't on any of the usual hiking maps, which made it perfect. No people, just us and nature, Jake had said, excited. I was the only one who hesitated. Something about being so far off the beaten path didn't sit right with me, but I didn't want to be the buzzkill. So, we packed up our gear and drove out there on a Friday afternoon. The drive was long, but the scenery was beautiful. Thick forests, winding roads, and mountains that seemed to go on forever. By the time we reached the spot where we'd leave the car and start hiking, the sun was starting to set. The trail wasn't really a trail at all, more like a suggestion of a path through the dense woods. We followed Jake's lead, hiking for about an hour until we found a small clearing by a stream, nestled at the base of a ridge. "This is perfect," Sarah said, setting down her backpack. Tom nodded in agreement, already unpacking the tent. I was tired from the hike, but there was something about the air, cool and crisp, that felt refreshing. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. We spent the evening setting up camp, building a fire, and cooking dinner. The mood was light, and we joked around like we always did. Jake had brought a few beers, and after a while, we were all laughing like idiots, telling ghost stories and talking about nothing in particular. It was the kind of night where everything feels simple and right. Then, just as the fire was starting to die down, we heard something. It was faint at first, a rustling noise in the trees. We all paused, looking at each other. The woods were quiet, too quiet, I realized. No animals, no insects, just the sound of the wind through the trees. But this wasn't the wind, it was something else. "Probably just a deer or something," Tom said, trying to sound casual. But his voice was tight, and I could tell he wasn't convinced. The rustling grew louder, closer. It was coming from the direction of the ridge where the trees were thickest. We all turned our heads in that direction, staring into the darkness. "Maybe we should check it out," Jake suggested, half joking. "No way," Sarah said quickly. "Let's just go to bed." But Jake wasn't having it. He grabbed a flashlight and stood up, shining the beam toward the trees. "Come on, it's probably nothing." I didn't want to go. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. But Jake was already walking toward the edge of the clearing, and Tom followed him. I glanced at Sarah, who looked as uneasy as I felt, but we both reluctantly got up and went after them. The light from Jake's flashlight bounced around the trees as we moved deeper into the woods. The sound had stopped, but the silence was unnerving. The further we went, the more I felt like we shouldn't be there. It's hard to explain, but it was like the air itself was thicker, heavier. Each step felt harder than the last. After a few minutes, we reached the base of the ridge. The trees were so dense here that Jake's flashlight barely pierced the darkness. We stood there, listening, but all we could hear was the sound of our own breathing. "See?" Jake said, sounding disappointed. "Nothing." Tom let out a nervous laugh. "Guess we scared it off." But just as we were about to turn back, we heard it again. This time it wasn't rustling. It was a low, guttural sound, like a growl. My heart stopped. Jake swung the flashlight around, trying to find the source of the noise, but there was nothing. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, more to himself than to us. We stood there, frozen, straining to hear it again. For a long moment there was nothing, and then without warning, the sound came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something moving through the trees. I don't know why, but instead of running, we stayed. I could feel every muscle in my body tensing, but I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the trees in front of us, waiting for something, anything, to appear. Suddenly, Jake's flashlight flickered. It went out for a second, and when it came back on, something was standing at the edge of the light. At first, it was hard to make out, but as the light steadied, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the trees. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were glowing, reflecting the light like an animal's. But it wasn't an animal. It was human, or something that had once been human. Sarah gasped, and I heard Tom swear under his breath. Jake, for the first time, was speechless. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring at us. I don't know how long we stood like that, locked in that horrible, silent standoff. It could have been seconds, or it could have been hours. But then, without warning, the figure moved. Not toward us, thank God, but away, slipping deeper into the forest. It was gone in an instant, like it had never been there at all. For a few seconds, none of us moved. Then Jake whispered, "We need to go. Now." We didn't argue. We turned and ran back to the campsite as fast as we could, not caring about the noise we were making. When we got back, Sarah was already packing up her things. "We're leaving," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not staying here another minute." None of us argued. We quickly packed up our gear, dousing the fire as best we could. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing standing at the edge of the clearing again. But the forest was still, as if nothing had ever happened. The hike back to the car was a blur. We didn't talk, didn't even look at each other. All I could think about was getting out of there. The whole time, I felt like we were being watched. The trees seemed closer, darker. Every sound made my heart race. When we finally reached the car, we threw our stuff in the trunk and got the hell out of there. No one said a word the entire drive back. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen, even if none of us could explain it. We never spoke about it again. Jake tried to act like it never happened, but I could see it in his eyes. He was scared, just like the rest of us. Tom and Sarah broke up a few weeks later. I don't know if it had anything to do with that night, but I think it did. Something changed in all of us after that. As for me, I haven't been camping since. I can't. Every time I think about going back into the woods, I see that thing standing there, watching us. I know it's still out there, waiting, and I'm terrified that one day it will find me again. I'd always thought of myself as a night owl, thriving on the stillness of the dark hours. Working the graveyard shift at the local diner was never more than a means to an end, just a job to pay the bills while I figured out what I truly wanted in life. But that was before everything changed. It started one ordinary night. The diner was quiet, the kind of quiet that's almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator or the clink of silverware. The neon sign outside flickered intermittently, casting an eerie glow through the window. It was just me and the coffee pot, trying to stay awake during the long hours of solitude. Around 1 a.m., I noticed a man standing outside, his figure casting a long shadow in the dim light. He was tall, his features obscured by the dark, but I could feel his eyes on me, even through the glass. I brushed it off as a figment of my overactive imagination. After all, it wasn't unusual for drifters to pass through this part of town. But then he came in. I remember the bell above the door jingling as he walked in, his presence somehow more unsettling up close. His clothes were disheveled, and there was something off about his eyes, too intense, too unyielding. He ordered a coffee and sat at the far end of the counter, never once taking his eyes off me. I tried to stay calm, forcing a polite smile as I served him his coffee. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and rough. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the hours ticked by, I did my best to ignore him. My shift dragged on, and the man remained at his seat, nursing his coffee and occasionally glancing at me. It was unnerving, but I had been in stranger situations before. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid. It wasn't until the clock struck 3 a.m. that things took a turn for the worse. The man stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He approached the counter, his demeanor suddenly menacing. My heart pounded in my chest as he leaned in close. "You're still here, alone?" he asked, his breath hot against my ear. "Don't you get lonely?" I tried to remain professional, forcing a chuckle. "Just doing my job. It's not too bad." He didn't smile. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small object. My heart nearly stopped as I recognized it as a knife. My breath caught in my throat. "I don't like to be alone," he said, his eyes narrowing, "and I don't like it when people ignore me." I had to act quickly. I took a step back, reaching for the phone behind the counter. I didn't have time to call the police. He was already moving towards me, his intentions clear. Adrenaline surged through me, and I grabbed a nearby coffee pot, swinging it at him. The hot liquid splashed across his face, making him stumble back with a howl of pain. That's when I bolted. I ran out of the diner and into the parking lot, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't dare look back. My car was parked a few spaces away, and I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I managed to get inside and lock the doors just as he reached the car. I could see his shadow moving outside, his angry shouts echoing through the night. I started the engine and sped away, my mind racing. I drove straight to the nearest police station, my hands trembling on the wheel. I told them everything, about the man, the knife, the terror I felt. They took my statement seriously, and I thought for a moment that maybe, just maybe, I would be safe. But then came the part that shattered my sense of security. The police couldn't find him. They sent officers to the diner and combed the area, but there was no trace of the man. The security footage from the diner was useless. It only showed a blurry figure leaving the scene. There were no witnesses other than me, and no sign of the man's whereabouts. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the fear never truly left me. Every shadow, every unfamiliar face seemed like a potential threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me. I kept my job at the diner for a while longer, but the unease lingered. I started carrying pepper spray and avoided staying alone as much as possible. I moved to a new apartment, hoping that a change of scenery would help me feel safer. Sometimes, when the night is still and quiet, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, his eyes watching me from the darkness. I know he could be anywhere, and that uncertainty is the most terrifying part of all. The man was never found, and though I've tried to move on, the fear still haunts me. I've come to realize that some nightmares don't have a clear ending. They just linger, waiting to resurface when you least expect it. The street was eerily quiet that night, cloaked in an unsettling silence that only seemed to amplify the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. I remember it clearly, how I walked down that deserted road with an uneasy sense of foreboding settling over me. I had been out with friends earlier, but as the evening wore on and the moon climbed higher in the sky, I decided to head home. I had always taken this route before. It was a well-trodden path, familiar and safe. Yet tonight, something felt off. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to dance more menacingly in the dim streetlight glow, or the sudden drop in temperature that made me shiver despite my jacket. Whatever it was enough to make me quicken my pace, my footsteps echoing unnervingly off the pavement. Halfway down the street, I noticed a figure standing beneath one of the flickering street lamps. The light was so weak that the figure appeared almost ghostly. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but all I could see was a silhouette, tall, with broad shoulders. My heart began to race, not from fear, but from the unsettling sense of familiarity. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen this person before. I tried to walk past without drawing attention, but the figure seemed to notice me. They started to follow at a leisurely pace, just behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but the figure stopped and remained still, like a statue in the shadows. I decided to keep my head down and walk faster, hoping that if I ignored them, they would lose interest. As I reached a corner, I noticed a familiar face among the crowd of pedestrians waiting for the light to change. It was Emily, an old classmate from high school. I waved, relieved to see a friendly face. She waved back, and we exchanged a quick "hi" before I returned to my hurried pace. Just as I turned the corner, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Startled, I spun around to find the figure from before standing directly in front of me. They were closer than I realized, their face now illuminated by the streetlight. It was a man in his late 30s, with a disheveled beard and hollow eyes that bore into me with unsettling intensity. "Hey," he said, his voice raspy and uneven. "You got a minute?" I took a step back, my heart pounding. "No, I'm sorry, I need to go." Before I could react, the man grabbed my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong, and I could feel his nails digging into my skin. I struggled to free myself, but his hold only tightened. Panic surged through me as I looked around for help, but the street was deserted. My mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. "Let go of me," I shouted, but the man only seemed more determined. Just then, Emily's voice called out from behind. "Is everything okay?" The man released me and turned to face her, a look of sheer panic crossing his face. No, it's nothing. I was just trying to get directions. Emily must have seen the terror in my eyes because she immediately stepped forward, her expression turning serious. "I think it's best if you leave now." The man hesitated, then backed away, disappearing into the shadows. Emily rushed over to me, concern etched on her face. "Are you all right? You looked like you were in trouble." I nodded, still shaken. "Thanks for coming by. That guy, he was really creepy." Emily offered to walk me home, and I gratefully accepted. We chatted about old times, trying to push the unsettling encounter out of my mind. By the time I reached my apartment, the tension had eased somewhat, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After Emily left, I locked the door and tried to focus on other things, watching TV, checking my phone. But the incident lingered, and I found myself glancing nervously out the window every few minutes. Every shadow seemed to move with malicious intent. Every sound outside amplified into something sinister. As I finally drifted off to sleep, the night seemed to close in around me. My dreams haunted by the hollow eyes of the man who had tried to grab me. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would turn my life upside down. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight streaming through the blinds. It felt like a fresh start, but the previous night's events still cast a shadow over my day. I tried to go about my routine as normal, brushing my teeth, making breakfast, heading to work, but everything felt tinted with unease. Work was a distraction, a chance to focus on something other than the terror I had felt. But the shadows of the previous night seemed to follow me, lingering at the edge of my consciousness. My coworkers noticed my distracted demeanor, but I brushed off their concern with forced smiles and half-hearted explanations. That evening, I returned home and found an envelope slipped under my door. It was plain, with no return address, but my name was written neatly on the front. My heart raced as I opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. "I know where you live, and I'm not done with you yet." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just some random threat, it was personal. My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated. What if they couldn't do anything? What if it was just a prank? My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening. Unable to shake the fear, I decided to take precautions. I checked all the locks on my doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. I even installed a small security camera that I had been meaning to get for a while. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The following days were a blur of anxiety. I avoided going out alone and made sure to keep my phone charged and within reach at all times. Every creak in the building, every gust of wind against the window made me jump. I couldn't concentrate on anything, and my sleep was plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures and menacing voices. One evening, as I was leaving work, I noticed something odd. The man from the night before. His face flashed in my memory as I saw him lurking across the street, his eyes following me. My heart skipped a beat. Was he stalking me? I tried to keep calm, walking briskly to my car and glancing over my shoulder repeatedly. That night, I decided to take a different route home, hoping to throw off any potential followers. I drove through winding back roads, avoiding my usual path. As I approached my apartment building, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The same man was standing across the street, his eyes locked onto my apartment window. Fear gripped me, and I quickly parked and went inside, locking the door behind me. I called the police, but when they arrived, the man was nowhere to be found. I felt like I was losing my mind. The police couldn't find any evidence of wrongdoing and advised me to stay vigilant. Their words did little to soothe my frayed nerves. The next day, I decided to confront the situation head-on. I went to the local coffee shop, hoping to catch a break in the routine that had become a prison. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed a familiar face at a nearby table. Emily. She waved me over, and I joined her, grateful for some normalcy. "Hey," Emily greeted me with a warm smile. "How have you been?" I hesitated before telling her about the note and the man. Her expression grew serious as I recounted the details. "This is really concerning," she said. "Have you thought about telling someone who might be able to help?" I nodded, but something about her demeanor made me uneasy. It wasn't just concern, it was something more. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it made me question if I really knew her as well as I thought. The days went by in a haze of fear and paranoia. I checked my security footage constantly, searching for any sign of the man. One night, as I reviewed the footage, I noticed something alarming. There was a figure moving around my apartment building, just outside my door, at odd hours. It wasn't clear enough to make out any details, but the footage was enough to keep me on edge. I tried to maintain some semblance of normal life, but the constant fear was overwhelming. I couldn't focus on anything other than the man's presence. It was as if he was always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows of my life. The following week, my anxiety reached a breaking point. I started avoiding my apartment as much as possible, spending time at public places, and trying to stay busy. My job became a refuge from the constant dread that hung over me. One evening, as I returned home after work, I received a call from an unknown number. My hands trembled as I answered. "Hello?" I said. There was a pause on the other end before a voice spoke, distorted and unrecognizable. "You're running out of time. I hope you're ready for the truth." The call ended abruptly. My heart raced as I stared at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. I decided to call the police again, but this time they seemed less concerned. "We'll investigate the call," they said. But their lack of urgency did nothing to ease my fear. I needed answers, and I knew I couldn't rely on the authorities alone. My mind raced through all the possibilities, trying to piece together the puzzle of this relentless nightmare. I thought back to everything I had experienced, searching for any clue that could explain why I was being targeted. The next day, I made a decision. I had to find out more about the man who was tormenting me. I started with the most obvious step, visiting the coffee shop where Emily and I had met. It was a cozy place, and I hoped that maybe someone there might have seen something useful. I approached the counter and asked the barista, a young woman with a friendly demeanor, if she remembered seeing anyone unusual in the past few weeks. She thought for a moment, then said, "Well, now that you mention it, there was a guy who used to come in here a lot. He always seemed kind of off. I haven't seen him in a while, though." I felt a shiver down my spine. Could this be the same man? "Do you remember what he looked like?" The barista described him in detail. Disheveled clothes, a scruffy beard, and those intense, unsettling eyes. It matched the man who had confronted me. I thanked her and left the coffee shop, my mind racing. I needed more information, but where to turn next? I decided to visit the local library. It might seem like an odd choice, but I hoped that researching local crime reports or old news articles could provide some insight. I spent hours poring over old newspapers, looking for anything that might connect to my situation. The library was quiet, and the rows of bookshelves felt like they were closing in on me. After several hours, I found something that made my blood run cold. In an article dated several years back, there was a report about a string of violent incidents involving a man who matched the description of my stalker. The cases were unsolved, and the man had vanished without a trace. The article mentioned that the man had a history of stalking and had been linked to several disappearances. My hands trembled as I read the article. Could this be the same person? I felt a mix of fear and determination. If this man was connected to these past crimes, then he was a serious threat. I had to do something. The following day, I received another envelope at my apartment. This time, it contained a single photograph, one of me, taken from outside my window. My heart pounded as I realized how close the man had gotten to my private space. I felt a surge of anger and fear. This was no longer just a creepy encounter. It was a personal violation. I decided to confront Emily about what I had discovered. I met her at the coffee shop, and as we sat down, I showed her the photograph and the newspaper article. Her eyes widened as she took in the details. "This is serious," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to do something." I nodded, relieved to have her support. "I think the man might be connected to the cases in the article. If he's still out there, we need to find out more about him." Emily agreed, and together we started digging deeper into the local news archives and reaching out to contacts who might know more about the case. We spent days researching, piecing together fragments of information. One night, as we were going through the records at Emily's apartment, we stumbled upon something chilling. Among the documents was a police report that mentioned a specific detail: a scar on the man's left hand. It was a detail I remembered from my encounter. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't just a random act of terror. It was part of a larger, more sinister pattern. The next day, as I walked back to my apartment, I noticed something different. The street was lined with police cars and investigators. I learned that there had been a recent break-in at a nearby building, and the suspect matched the description of the man who had been stalking me. The police had finally caught a lead. My heart sank as I saw the suspect being led away in handcuffs. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. While it was good that there was finally a resolution, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Later that evening, Emily and I were called to the police station to give our statements. The lead detective, a gruff man with a no-nonsense attitude, questioned us about our encounters with the suspect. I recounted every detail, from the initial confrontation to the photograph. After we finished, the detective pulled me aside. "We've been working on this case for a long time," he said. "The suspect is a known offender, and we have evidence linking him to multiple crimes. We believe he was targeting you as part of a larger scheme." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, a larger scheme?" The detective hesitated before continuing. "It seems he was part of a network of individuals involved in organized stalking and harassment. We're still investigating the full extent of their operations, but we're hopeful this arrest will lead to more answers." The weight of the revelation was overwhelming. What had started as a personal nightmare was now part of a much larger and more complex web of horror. As I left the police station, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were still pieces missing from the puzzle. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The fear that had once consumed me had been replaced by a deep sense of uncertainty. The man who had terrorized me was in custody, but the knowledge that there were others like him out there made my skin crawl. The nightmare was far from over. I had survived, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. I knew I would have to live with the shadows of this experience, forever marked by the terror that had invaded my life. For what felt like an eternity, I sat frozen in the car, the darkness around me pressing in from all sides. The whispers, they were everywhere, threading through my mind like tendrils of fog. At first, they were just indistinct murmurs, like a distant conversation I couldn't quite catch. But as the moments dragged on, the words started to take shape, forming sentences that chilled me to my core. "You should have never stopped. She found you. You can't escape now." I bolted upright, gasping for breath, and frantically scanned the rearview mirror again, expecting to see something or someone looming behind me in the back seat. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the empty, rain-slicked road outside and the eerie glow of the trees illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning in the distance. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself, running a hand through my damp hair. I had to stay focused. This was just exhaustion. Maybe I was still on edge from picking up that strange woman. That's what it was. Nothing supernatural, no ghosts, just paranoia. I fumbled with the ignition, turning the key again and again, willing the car to start, but the engine remained dead. The dashboard lights flickered for a moment, then went dark, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I slammed my fists against the wheel in frustration. Suddenly, the rain stopped. The shift was so abrupt, so unnatural, that it felt like the world itself had paused. No more pattering on the windshield, no wind whistling through the trees, just silence. And in that silence, the whispers returned. "We see you. We've been waiting." My pulse quickened. I looked out through the passenger window where the woman had disappeared just moments ago. She was nowhere in sight, but I had the distinct sensation that she hadn't gone far. I needed to get out of there fast. But without a working car, I was stuck. There was only one option now: leave the vehicle and walk back to town, even if I had no idea how far I was from the nearest sign of civilization. Anything was better than staying here, surrounded by whatever this presence was. Grabbing my phone from the passenger seat, I checked the battery. Dead. Of course. With no other choice, I pushed the door open and stepped out into the unnerving quiet. The air was thick and damp, and though the rain had stopped, The ground was still wet beneath my feet. The only sound was the occasional drip of water from the leaves above. Everything else, the insects, the wind, the world, seemed to be holding its breath. I looked up and down the road. It stretched out into the darkness in both directions, a seemingly endless tunnel of trees. Taking a deep breath, I started walking, the crunch of gravel under my shoes the only noise to keep me company. The further I went, the more the road seemed to change. It wasn't just the trees, which now seemed more gnarled and twisted than I remembered. The air itself felt wrong. It pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, as if the atmosphere had thickened somehow. And then there was the fog. It rolled in slowly, curling along the road like smoke, rising from the ground in tendrils. In minutes, I was completely enveloped, the world reduced to a swirling, ghostly white. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. My footsteps slowed as I strained to make out any landmarks, but everything was lost in the haze. That's when I saw her. The woman. She was standing just ahead, barely visible through the mist. Her back was to me, her soaked clothes still clinging to her body. Her posture was eerily still, too still, like a statue carved from stone. A shiver ran down my spine, but I didn't move. I wanted to call out, to ask what she was doing there, but my throat felt tight, as if the fog had seeped into my lungs. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. And then slowly she began to turn. Her movements were agonizingly slow, deliberate, as if she was savoring the moment. My heart pounded in my chest and I took an involuntary step back. The fog swirled around her as she turned fully to face me, and when I finally saw her face, I nearly screamed. It wasn't the woman I had picked up. The figure standing in front of me was something else entirely. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, God, her eyes, were empty black pits, deeper and darker than anything I had ever seen. But it wasn't just her appearance. It was the feeling that radiated from her, a deep, gnawing emptiness that seemed to reach out and wrap itself around me, pulling me closer. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, though her lips didn't move. My legs felt rooted to the spot. My body paralyzed with fear. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. It was as if the fog itself was holding me in place, dragging me deeper into whatever nightmare I had stumbled into. The whispers grew louder, not just around me but inside me, as if they were crawling through my mind. They echoed with 100 different voices, all blending together into a cacophony of terror. I tried to cover my ears, but it did nothing to block them out. "You can't leave. She's already found you." The figure stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound as they touched the wet ground. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, but I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in that fog, with her staring at me with those empty eyes. Time seemed to lose meaning. But then, just as suddenly as it had come, the fog began to recede. It didn't lift. It was more like it was being pulled away, sucked into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. The woman, or whatever she was, faded with it, dissolving into the mist until she was nothing more than a shadow. And then she was gone. I stood there, my legs trembling, my mind reeling. The whispers had stopped, leaving behind a heavy silence that was almost worse. I wanted to believe that it was over, that I could wake up from this nightmare and everything would be back to normal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I was marked now. Whatever that thing was, whatever force had brought her into my life, it wasn't done with me. With shaking hands, I pulled the crumpled photo from my pocket. It was the same one, the old image of me standing in front of that house, a house I hadn't thought about in years. But now, there was something new, something that hadn't been there before. In the corner of the photo, just barely visible, was the silhouette of a figure standing in the distance, watching me. It was her. I stumbled back to the car, my mind racing. The whispers had stopped, and the fog had thinned out, but the fear still clung to me like a second skin. I had to get out of here, had to find a way back home, but I knew now that it wasn't just the road that had changed. Something had followed me, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to escape. When I finally reached the car, the cold sweat on my brow mixed with the remnants of rain that still clung to my clothes. I fumbled with the door, forcing myself inside and slamming it shut behind me. I wanted to start the engine, to feel the engine's hum beneath me, but the car remained lifeless. The battery had been completely drained, likely from my earlier attempts to restart it. Despair settled over me like a thick fog. I couldn't stay here, not with the feeling of being watched and those ghastly whispers in my head. The only thing I could do was try to find help or somehow make my way back to town, though I had no idea how far I was from civilization. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The mist was slowly dissipating, revealing the dark silhouettes of trees and the occasional flash of distant lightning. I needed to focus. I couldn't let my mind wander or get caught up in the terror. I had to move. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, its beam cutting through the darkness as I stepped out of the car. The road was still eerily quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant rumble of thunder. As I walked, the shadows seemed to play tricks on my eyes. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig felt like a signal of something closing in on me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I had to keep forcing myself to move forward, step by step. My legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last. I didn't know how long I had been walking when I saw it. At first, it was just a glimmer of light through the trees. I quickened my pace, hoping it was a sign of a house or even a passing car. The light grew brighter as I approached, and soon I found myself standing in front of an old, decrepit house. The house was familiar. It was the same one from the photograph. The house I had stood in front of as a kid. The house I had tried so hard to forget. The paint was peeling, the windows were boarded up, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. It was as if it had been waiting for me, sitting in silence all these years. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the front door. I didn't want to go inside, but I felt a pull, a need to confront whatever had been haunting me. I pushed the door open, and it creaked on its hinges, revealing a dark, musty interior. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The house smelled of damp and decay, the air thick and oppressive. I moved cautiously, shining the light around, trying to get a sense of my surroundings. The living room was a mess, furniture covered in sheets, dust accumulating on every surface. It was like walking into a time capsule, a place frozen in time. I walked through the room, heading towards the stairs, but stopped when I saw something on the wall, a family portrait. The people in the photo looked familiar. The same faces, the same expressions as in the photograph from earlier. But this was no ordinary family portrait. The faces were distorted, twisted into expressions of fear and anguish, their eyes staring out as if pleading for help. I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind raced to make sense of it all. Was this a clue? A message? I didn't know, but I had to keep moving. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The upper floor was just as derelict as the rest of the house, with rooms that seemed to have been abandoned for years. I moved through them, searching for any sign of life or answers, but all I found were more remnants of a past long gone. Finally, I reached a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint light emanating from within. My breath caught in my throat as I pushed it open. The room was empty, save for a large mirror hanging on the far wall. But this wasn't any ordinary mirror. The glass was cracked and shattered, but what caught my attention was the reflection. In the mirror, I saw not just myself, but something or someone else. Behind me, standing in the doorway, was the woman. Her figure was faint and ghostly, like an echo of something that had been long gone. Her eyes were still those empty black pits, her expression still as haunting as ever. I spun around, but there was no one there. The doorway was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and the woman was gone. I took a step closer, my reflection showing the growing fear in my eyes. The whispers began again, this time louder, more insistent. You're part of the story now. You can't escape what you are. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. The whispers were coming from everywhere, filling the room with their echoes. I turned again, looking for the source, but all I found was the empty room and the mirror. The cracks in the mirror seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, spreading out like veins. I moved closer, drawn to the mirror's surface, unable to tear my eyes away. The reflection began to change, showing scenes that weren't part of my reality. Images of the house as it once was, filled with people who looked like the figures in the family portrait, but now their faces were twisted in terror. "You're one of us now. You can't leave. You belong here." The room began to spin, the walls closing in, the whispers becoming a roar. I felt a presence behind me, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to seep through the walls, through the cracks in the mirror. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My vision blurred, and I stumbled backward, feeling as though I was falling into the mirror itself. In a final burst of clarity, I turned and ran, down the stairs, out of the house. The night air was cold and sharp against my skin, but it was a relief from the oppressive atmosphere inside. I didn't look back as I fled down the road, my mind reeling from the images and whispers that still echoed in my head. I ran as fast as I could, driven by the primal urge to escape, to find safety. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I pushed on, not stopping until I reached the edge of town. When I finally collapsed on the side of the road, panting and exhausted, I looked back towards the house, hoping against hope that it was just a bad dream, that everything would return to normal. But the house was gone, the road was empty, and the night was still. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I truly escaped, or if something else followed me, something that will forever be a part of my life. But one thing is certain. Whatever I encountered at that house, whatever presence was waiting for me, it has left its mark. I'm not the same person I was before. I hear the whispers in my dreams, feel the cold touch of that presence in the dark. And I know that no matter how far I run, no matter where I go, I will always be a part of the story that began on that dark, rainy night. So if you ever find yourself driving down a lonely road on a stormy night, and you see someone standing by the side of the road, remember this. Some stories are better left untold. Some roads are better left untraveled. And some people are best left alone.
In the small, forgotten town of Wexford, where the trees grew twisted and the fog never seemed to lift, there was a bus driver named Harold Finch. Harold had worked for Wexford Transit for 20 years, and in all that time, he had seen some strange things. But nothing prepared him for what happened one cold, misty evening in October. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a heavy gray. Harold's old bus, a rickety thing from the 90s, rattled and groaned as it trundled down the empty streets. The streetlights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows that danced on the cracked sidewalks. Harold sighed, glancing at the empty seats. It had been a slow night, and he was looking forward to heading home. The bus's heater wheezed softly, barely making a dent in the chill that seeped through the windows. He glanced at the clock. 9:30 p.m. Just one more round, then he could call it a night. The bus screeched to a halt at the next stop, and Harold peered out into the gloom. A small group of passengers shuffled onto the bus. They were an odd bunch, their clothing old-fashioned, like something out of a time-worn photograph. They wore long coats and hats, their faces hidden in shadows. Not a single one of them spoke or made eye contact. Harold frowned, sensing an unsettling vibe from the group. He tried to shake off the feeling, reminding himself that he dealt with all kinds of people over the years. He watched as the strangers found their seats, their movements stiff and mechanical. He continued his route, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at his silent passengers. Their faces remained obscured, their heads bowed as if in mourning. The bus journey seemed to stretch longer than usual, and the air grew heavier with every mile. At each stop, Harold expected someone to get off, but no one did. The streets of Wexford seemed to grow darker and more deserted with each passing moment. Harold felt a shiver run down his spine, his breath fogging up the glass. As the bus approached the final stop on the route, Harold felt a growing sense of dread. The destination was an old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place where few ventured, especially at night. The cemetery was surrounded by a wrought iron fence, and the gate was always locked tight. The bus came to a halt, and Harold turned to address his passengers. "This is the last stop, folks," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're at the cemetery. This is where you get off." One by one, the passengers stood up and moved toward the door. Harold's heart pounded as he watched them exit the bus. They moved with an eerie grace, their footsteps barely making a sound on the pavement. As the last passenger stepped off the bus, Harold felt a sudden chill. He turned to look at them, and for the first time, he saw their faces clearly. His blood ran cold. The passengers weren't just old-fashioned. They were skeletal, their skin stretched tight over their bones. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions frozen in a mournful grimace. Harold's hand trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, but the sight of them was burned into his memory. He watched as they drifted toward the cemetery gate, their forms dissolving into the fog. The gate creaked open, and they disappeared into the darkness. Harold's breath came in short gasps. He glanced at the bus's clock. 10:15 p.m. The journey had taken longer than usual. He looked back at the cemetery, feeling an overwhelming urge to leave. He started the bus, his hands shaking as he drove away from the graveyard. But as he made his way back through the fog-shrouded streets, he noticed something strange. The bus's rearview mirror was fogged up, but there were faint, ghostly figures visible through the condensation. They seemed to be following him, their forms shifting and wavering. Harold's panic grew with each mile. He tried to shake off the eerie feeling, but the figures remained, haunting his every turn. The bus's interior lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the seats. He decided to make an unscheduled stop at the old diner on the edge of town, hoping to clear his mind. As he pulled into the diner's lot, he noticed something unsettling. The diner's neon sign, usually bright and welcoming, was now dim and flickering. He stepped off the bus, his breath visible in the cold air. The diner's door creaked open, and Harold entered, hoping to find some comfort. The place was empty, the tables and chairs scattered haphazardly. The only sound was the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Harold approached the counter and called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" There was no response. He felt a creeping sense of unease. The clock ticked louder, each second stretching into an eternity. He turned to leave, but as he did, he saw a figure sitting in one of the booths. It was a man, dressed in a suit from another era, his face obscured by shadows. Harold's heart raced. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The man slowly looked up, revealing hollow eyes and a mournful expression. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he asked, his voice a hollow whisper. Harold nodded, unable to speak. The man continued, "They're not supposed to be seen. They're trapped, just like me. They were lost souls, forever bound to that cemetery." The man's words sent a shiver down Harold's spine. He backed away, stumbling toward the door. As he left the diner, he glanced back to see the man vanish into thin air. Harold returned to the bus, his mind reeling. He had to finish his route and get out of Wexford. He drove through the foggy streets, his senses on high alert. As he approached the cemetery again, he saw something horrifying. The cemetery gate was wide open, and the fog seemed to be swirling around it, forming ghostly shapes. The skeletal figures he had seen earlier were emerging from the fog, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Harold's breath caught in his throat. He tried to drive past, but the bus wouldn't move. It was as if the fog had ensnared it, holding it in place. The figures grew closer, their mournful wails filling the air. Desperately, Harold tried to start the bus, but the engine sputtered and died. The figures reached the bus, their skeletal hands pressing against the windows. Harold could see their hollow eyes staring at him, their mouths moving silently. In that moment, Harold realized the truth. The bus wasn't just a vehicle, it was a gateway, and the souls he had seen were trapped, forever bound to the route he drove. The figures began to drift into the bus, their cold presence filling the space. Harold felt a chill unlike anything he had ever experienced. He was surrounded by the ghostly apparitions, their mournful wails growing louder. As the figures closed in on him, Harold's vision blurred. He felt a cold, bony hand touch his shoulder, and everything went dark. The next morning, the bus was found abandoned at the cemetery gate. The only thing inside was the driver's empty seat and the faint echo of mournful whispers. Harold Finch was never seen again, and the townspeople of Wexford spoke of the ghostly bus that roamed the streets, carrying lost souls to their final destination. And so, the tale of Harold Finch became another chapter in Wexford's dark history. A cautionary tale of a bus ride that should never be taken and the souls forever trapped in the fog.